So we need to make a start. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. It's really wonderful to see so many people here, especially on what's it's a lovely day. We'll be able to take a glass of wine outside if we do our work first. This is I'm delighted to see you all here because it's a very special occasion for us here at Egenis, because we get to one of the very lovely sort of births of academia, you know, when you get in an academic literature, when you get to welcome a new book, this book from John, and Everyone Flows, A Process Philosophy of Human Life. I probably don't need to say too much to introduce John, but in case there are people here who don't know him as well as many of us do, John is one of the founding directors of our institute here, Egenis. He has a very large number of accolades to his name, and I'm just going to mention one of them that is the most recent one. John is a fellow of the American Philosophical Society, which includes a fellowship which includes some much lesser known names like, and I have a list, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, Marie Curie. I think there's also George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in there somewhere as well. So he's in good company. And we're just really delighted to be here to celebrate the launch of John's book, which I think stemmed from his Gifford Lectures, which he gave in May, roughly 2 years ago, 2023, at the University of Edinburgh, a very prestigious lecture series. And I suppose the longer history for the book is the Process Biology project, which was supported by a ERC Advanced grant here, which many of you were involved in, and resulted in a wonderful volume called Everything Flows, which has already had an enormous influence in the field. And I suppose this is a sort of follow-up. We're really delighted to be able to celebrate it today. Also really delighted to be able to welcome our visitor, Tim Lewens, who's again known to quite a few people here in the community. Tim is Professor of Philosophy of Science in the History of Philosophy of Science Department at the University of Cambridge, which I think many of us have connections with. Slightly terrifyingly, I think it's 20 years ago that you, as a presumably just starting out as a lecturer in the department, and others managed to entice me away from the mathematics trials and started doing philosophy, which must have been a tough task, I think. We were just children. 20 years ago. But we're delighted, we're really lucky to have Tim here. Not only is he one of the UK's most prominent philosophers of biology, I should say world, because I think actually national significance is the lowest ranking on the rank. Nationally significant gets you 1 star in the rank. So world gets you 2. World gets you 2, I think. So galactic significance gets you not fired. So we're really delighted to have Tim here. One of the reasons we're so lucky to have Tim along today is that not only is he a very prominent philosopher of biology, who's written on all sorts of wonderful topics, books on Darwin and risk and cultural evolution and so on. He's also one of the few philosophers of biology who's written about human nature. And Tim also had, I think, an advanced ERC award about starting ground, wasn't it? You got a chance on human nature, and has a wonderful collection on why we disagree about human nature with Elizabeth Cannon, and a project title I realised I couldn't work out how to say it because it's a science of human nature ? So I have to sort of a science of human nature, sort of something like that. I have to get my intonation right to pronounce it. Okay, so the format for today is going to be a little different to a normal seminar. John's going to give a few introductory comments on the book, then we'll hand over to Tim for his talk. John will have a right to reply in case Tim has said some terrible things that he needs to immediately get in and respond to. Then we'll have our usual sort of comfort break of 5 minutes or so that we can use it after we get some water if it's too hot in here. We'll have Q&A for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be wine waiting for us in the book. Sound good? Okay, so John.
Right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to be very brief because I'm sure you don't want me to praise you the book. You can all buy it for
yes, I forgot.
For discounted price from UP. Maybe I'll just say this as if don't buy it from Amazon. Whatever, not just for the usual reasons, but because they have made a complete mess of advertising it, and they're now claiming to sell the paperback at a reduction of the price of the hardback, which is just slightly more than the actual price of the paperback. And they say they'll deliver it in 3 to 7 months, which seems to be a little. You think it'll come out? You think it'll come out? Anyway, right. So I just want to say just a tiny bit about the history of writing the book. Probably mostly Adam said it already, but I guess I was sort of framing it. I think this is, I guess it's a sort of book that comes from privilege. I mean, obviously the privilege of being invited to give the Tanner lectures, and of course, giving a short book length series of lectures is the sort of motivation that somebody like me needs, because so you say you're going to deliver a book on May the 17th. Yeah, well, it's June, July, whatever. Give lectures, you have to get it done. So I actually got the book written, and I had this other wonderful privilege of 3 months at STIAS, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, which is one of the most wonderful places to visit on the planet if you don't pay too much attention to your social environment, but pay a lot of attention to your immediate environment and to the incredible beauty of the surrounding country. And that's where I basically wrote this. So, so it was all kind of these lovely occasions to do it. And so the other thing about giving these sorts of lectures is you sort of want to say everything that's important to you. And what this really came to was a sort of précis of 20 years' work since I first had the insight that everything in the universe is process, and there are no things. There are no. This is the thing that the process that I've been working on for the last 20 years. And I guess I tried to sort of summarize it in 6 lectures, which ended up being my parvum opus, which is circulating around here, should anybody wish to look at copies of it. So, so okay, so about 20 years that I've been thinking this stuff. And there's basically half the book just summarizes why I think everybody should be a process philosopher, if they're a philosopher at all, and even if they're not. And particularly if you're interested in biology. So there's a chapter saying why organisms are all processes, which if you've heard me speak any time in the last 15 years, you'll certainly have heard me describe, so I probably won't do that now because quite a few of you have, but it's sort of obvious. I mean, you know, there's all this stuff going on in us all the time. I'm not just sitting there like in a chair. There's also a chapter on lineages, which I think are the second most interesting, possibly the most interesting kind of processes in the living world. And some philosophers of biology will know that years and years ago, David Hull and philosopher David Hull and biologist Michael Gieselin shocked everybody by saying that species, and more generally lineages, were individuals, not just classificatory terms. And I think I didn't believe it at the time, but finally I realized, once you realize they were individual processes, it all made sense. Obviously just very banal, like so much of this, but of course, philosophy is the art of saying interesting, banal things. So, and then finally, I guess there's a chapter on symbiosis, which is really, I think, probably the topic that got me first interested in processes, because I think realizing symbiosis makes you realize that living things are never really separable from one another. They're constantly and inextricably intertwined, as we are with our trillions of bacterial fellow travelers. And that was a very odd thought to have in the context of a world of things, but actually turns out to make perfect sense in the world of processes. So that's the first half of the book. Now, I guess the second half of the book, I've always really been interested in biology in a horribly humanistic way. I I think one of the reasons we're so interested in biology is because we're part of it, and I think probably quite a lot of philosophers of biology come to biology through worrying about themselves, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, the second half of the book tries to say why I think that all of this is important for thinking about what it is to be human. So this contains some probably rather eccentric treatments of some very familiar philosophical topics. There's a chapter on personal identity, which most of us philosophers here will know and probably hate from undergraduate days. As how do I know I'm the same person as I was yesterday, sort of stuff. But I think thinking of yourself as a process gives you some different insights into this. And there's a chapter even on an even more kind of hackneyed topic from general philosophy of freedom of the will, which again, I would like to say has a very different take in a process context. And then there's another chapter, and Adam mentioned human nature, which probably covers more topics than any chapter of 7,000 words possibly should cover, but it talks about human nature and it talks about humankinds with a few paragraphs on sex and gender, race, culture, you know, just one or two topics like that, all of course from a process perspective. So that's the book, and as I say, it's very basically just a condensation of everything I've been thinking of for a while. And I think that's probably really as much as I want to say, except just conclude by saying how really appreciative of Tim coming here, because I hate to be a hostage to fortune, but one of the people I would really like to like the book, a galactic expert on the topic, and also an old friend, and just all kinds of good reasons. And indeed, I guess let's talk about Cambridge. Again, I'm not going to count the years since I finished my PhD, not technically in HPS, but actually in HPS. I was technically in the philosophy department, but actually I hadn't heard of HPS at the time. And my supervisor was in HPS. So there's a little lineage-like link of a vague sort between myself and Tim. And I really look forward to hearing what he has to say about this. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. It's a real treat to be here. I was very, very flattered to be asked to speak about this book.
If you can get anywhere on the screen, wet it up.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. This is a lovely book. I do very much like this. I commend it to you all. This does some very unusual things for a philosopher. It takes some pretty serious, well thought through work in philosophy of biology, and then shows the purchase that work has for an exceptionally broad range of questions, and questions that one doesn't normally necessarily link back into the philosophy of biology, and questions that have a really immediate, I think, practical relevance for issues around race, around gender, even issues around questions of social equality as well. It's all done succinctly. It is a short book. One of the very impressive things, John, I think, is that there is some technical work there, but it's just as technical as it needs to be, and it never gets showy or intimidating or alienating in the level of technicality that it will take. So I'm a very, very big fan of this book. Let me just break down the overview, the overview of where I'm going to go with this talk. So, in the first part, I'm just going to try and have a go at articulating what I think the main picture is that John is trying to offer. And I do think sometimes that's a bit ambiguous, but I'm going to try and say what I think you think. In the second section, I'm going to address some issues where I think you maybe go a little bit fast. It is a short book and it covers a huge amount of ground. So I'll make a few critical comments in the second section. And then in the third section, I'm going to try and kind of pick up the baton. The overall message of this book is look at all of the payoffs that process thinking has, specifically the payoffs process thinking has for how one thinks about humans. And I'm just going to try and point to maybe a couple of additional areas where the process approach has value. Okay, so first of all, let's see what John's view is. So here are three images. It's a cow. John likes to talk about cows, not so much in this book actually, but in other works. That's a toaster. And this is meant to be a representation of a papal conclave, which I take it is a process, if anything is. Now, depending on exactly how you read John, you might come up with different answers to the question of how many of these images really depict bona fide things. One answer, and actually this was something that you said in your introductory remarks, is none of them depicts things because there aren't any things. A different answer is, well, this one has a thing in it because a toast is a thing, but a cow's a process and a conclave is a process. And a third answer is a conclave is a process, but a toast is a thing because it shows the right kind of stability for us to be interested in, and so a lot of the time does a cow. So you can see these different answers to the question in some different comments John makes in this book. So version one, the version that just says there just aren't any things. If you think there are, you've made a mistake. Right at the beginning, John says the Neo-Parmenidean world is a world of things, eternal things, atoms, and more or less stable things that are structures of atoms. I advocate a return to the world of your Heraclitus. There are no stable things at all, right? Very, very strong view. And you might think, well, that's a surprise. I thought there were plenty of stable things. In fact, you might think I thought that the problem was that some things are too damn stable. Plastic waste, forever chemicals, whereas some things aren't so stable. And so one way of pushing back might be, well, we want to be pluralist. There are some stable things and there are some unstable things, and it's important to keep track of what to work. But here's a different interpretation. Sometimes John does seem to say that there are some things. He says, a machine I take to be a kind of thing. My most general characterization of a process above was something that requires change to continue to exist. A table or a toaster, that's why I used that example in the previous slide, can be stored in the attic for many years and then taken out in much the same state as it was in. The toaster may even work, not so a duck or a mushroom. So toasters are things, but ducks and mushrooms aren't. For a duck to stay alive, literally trillions of chemical reactions must take place in its body every second. Now, let me try and say what I really think John's view is, having sown some confusion on how to resolve it. I think John's view says probably there aren't any things. And I'm saying things in bold words here. So the bold is not John's. The bold is mine, but I think it may help. So things, bold text mine, but the word is John's, are by default stable. They are autonomous. They have clear boundaries, they have essential properties that determine what kind of thing they are, and finally, they may continue to exist despite undergoing no change. So this is a fairly heavy-duty characterization of what a thing is. Now, John doesn't, I think, strictly deny that there's any possibility of putting together a vision of the universe that has things featuring somewhere, maybe right at its basis. He just thinks that probably the thing is follows. The process view gives us easy answers, productive answers to a huge range of questions about personal identity, evolution, freedom of the will. If you think of organisms as processes, then you have all sorts of payoffs in terms of thinking about free will, personal identity, human nature, even, as John alluded to, things like Thatcherism and inheritance tax, which are also mentioned in this book, certainly race, gender, and sex. And John's stance, I think, is that this explanatory case can be made for thinking of organisms as processes, and probably it's going to turn out that a similar case can be made at whatever micro level you choose to focus on. It will probably turn out, I think is John's view, that there are processes all the way down, and you won't find any things characterized in this way. Hence, probably, there aren't any things. Inferences to the best explanation are always inductive, they're never certain. There are, on the other hand, toasters, tables, Lego bricks, cows, maybe things at high levels of organisation as well, the Foreign Office, the patriarchy, that have the right kind of stability. They are the upshots of stabilising processes at the sort of timescales that interest us. So that's why it's perfectly reasonable for John to sometimes use thing talk, even though probably there aren't any things, once again, in bold. So this, I think, is John's view. We'll find out later on. Crucially, though, processes are sometimes able to stabilize entities such that it's reasonable for us to talk about them in broadly thing language, even if that need not correspond to things in this kind of sense. As he puts it, eddies can be very stable. I will buy a drink afterwards to the first person who comes to me correctly diagnosing who all of those eddies are. Doesn't apply if you're working. Okay. So eddies, including people, which are also eddies, are not stable by default. Nothing is stable eternally. Even when things are stable, their stability is not explained by their own intrinsic properties, rather they're explained usually by relations that they enter into in a broader processual context. And this view does not allow for essences at all. That I think is the view. Let me say a little bit about some things where I think, for me, the argument went a bit quickly, and I guess I want to know a little bit more. It's very clear that John is simultaneously in favour of a process view and against a form of essentialism. And one thing I'm interested in is to what extent these things can come apart. So if you're interested in things, you might ask questions like, could the Statue of Liberty have been made from different materials? Could Fido, the dog, have been better trained? Could he have been cat? Could he have been supermarket? And you might think, yeah, he could have been better trained. Probably could have been a cat. I don't even know what you mean when you ask, could he have been a supermarket? And John kind of reacts to all this kind of talk saying, look, just get rid of this notion of essence. Biological systems, as he puts it, don't have essences. And a lot of the constructive, a lot of the moves and payoff that John makes come from this liberation from essentialism. Instead, John likes to embrace a world of very rough boundaries, entities marked out according to pragmatic convenience. Processes, he says, don't require the sharp boundaries assumed for things, and counting of processes may often be a matter of arbitrary stipulation. And this kind of move is put to work very fruitfully many, many times in the book. For example, here's a passage from John talking about pregnancy. If life's a flow of activity, pregnancy is a bifurcation within that flow. One shouldn't expect any clear moment at which that bifurcation has been completed, for example. Now, you might think, though, that you can separate the question of whether we should endorse processes versus things from the question of whether we should be for essentialism or against essentialism. Because on the face of it, just like we can ask either more or less sensible sounding questions about the essences of things, we can also ask either more or less sensible sounding questions about processes. Could the recent conclave, that very conclave, have been conducted by a few different cardinals? Yeah. Could it have taken place in Avignon instead of Rome? Yeah, you can imagine that they might have said, sorry guys, the chapel's out of order, we're going to move you to Avignon for a while. Could it have taken place online? Could that very conclave have been a football match? Could it have been a different kind of process? Could it have instantiated the Krebs cycle? I mean, these questions become kind of increasingly weirder, and at a certain point you might say, no, I'm not willing to go that far. Now, John says processes don't need essences. But you might think, look, if processes don't need essences, then why saddle things with having to require essences? And if you think things do need essences for it to be intelligible to talk about them at all, then maybe processes need essences as well. We were talking about David Lewis earlier on. So imagine a thoroughgoing counterpart theorist who doesn't really like the idea that things ever really should have been thought of as having essences independent of some context of interest. That kind of person is likely to say exactly the same about processes. They'll think sometimes it makes sense to pick out counterparts of processes, sometimes it doesn't. So as Ned Hall puts it, even Lewis, who you might think of as a thing theorist, rejects the idea that things have primitive essences which somehow determine or constrain what's possible for them. Rather, it's ultimately up to us which respects of similarity we prioritize. Often this choice isn't fully settled, leaving the counterpart relation vague and context sensitive. So these kinds of moves were already available to thing theorists. It's not clear that you can only make them by going over to the process side. And even if you have gone onto the process side, it will still be very tempting at certain points to say, hang on a minute, now we've imagined the process being so different, it's no longer clear that it really is a process of the same kind after all, which is just what John says. He's considering life extension, stabilizing one temporal stage of the life cycle, one hopes a relatively youthful one, for a period many times the current lifespan of the entire cycle, would be to create a fundamentally different kind of being. This sounds like essencing talk, albeit about processes. John thinks things are really bad. And he thinks thing language gets you in all kinds of terrible places, like Thatcherism. For a thing ontologist, it's natural to think of individuals as autonomous entities that interact to make a new entity, society. And it's these autonomous constituent individuals that determine what this new entity does. Autonomy is, after all, one of the fundamental characteristics of the thing. Or perhaps, as Margaret Thatcher, the notorious champion of individualist ideology, famously remarked, society does not exist at all. So John here is suggesting that if you buy into the thing ontology, you're thereby more likely to find yourself endorsing a fairly aggressive form of unpleasant individualism. And here I can sort of see how it works, but again, I thought maybe that was a bit quick. So even if you have been persuaded by the process view, eddies, remember, are robust. Eddies are stable, at least sometimes. And so you could be a process theorist and still think that it's turned out that human processes have a particular kind of robustness that means they don't care very much about each other. Or maybe you don't think that. Maybe you think they should care about each other. But it's not clear the process view is going to do that by itself. And even the thing view, even the bold thing view, as I'm putting it here, allows very, very low-level autonomous things to form higher-level interdependent things. So maybe people are higher-level interdependent things that are constituted by low-level autonomous things. I don't think the thing view by itself tells you which way you should go. And just to give an example here, and I owe this to Cassandra Yang, current PhD student who I've been working with. Her work looks at the many varieties of organicism at work in British biology in the first half of the 20th century. So this is Joseph Needham on organicism, and in some ways Needham sounds very thing theoretic here. We can't consider nature otherwise than as a series of levels of organization, a series of dialectical syntheses from ultimate physical particles. So you begin with the ultimate physical particle very much in this nasty thing way. To atom, from atom to molecule, from molecule to colloid to aggregate, from aggregate to living cell, from cell to organ, from organ to body, from animal body to social association, the series of organizational levels is complete. So he thinks that through a series of, admittedly, processes, things become combined together in this elaborate series of hierarchical levels. Now, I'm not saying this to convince you that Needham's view is right. I'm merely saying this to convince you that there are people who buy into the thing view, and they're dialectical materialists, and thoroughly committed to a strong form of socialism. The thing view certainly doesn't inevitably get you to Thatcher. Maybe sometimes it does. Needham says the consequences of this point of view are boundless. Social evolution is continuous with biological evolution. The highest stages of social organization embodied in advanced ethics and in socialism are not a pious hope based on optimistic ideas about human nature, but a necessary consequence of all foregoing evolution. Okay. Third point. So John mentioned some of his work on symbiosis. And he tries to present the thing view as in a particularly sticky situation here. And this is in the context of discussions of holobiont. So it turns out that humans need bacteria to be able to function properly. The lineage of the bacterial symbiont is quite distinct from that of host macro. And hence holobionts are not lineage forming. And if they're not lineage forming, it appears they are not the individuals that evolved. The problem is, it seems to me, unanswerable in a world of things. So this is one point where John really does say the thing theory can't handle this kind of materialism. If a human is a thing that evolved, but the thing that evolved cannot function in the way a human does, we have an impasse. So I think the argument goes something like this. It's only holobionts that are functional humans. If you've just got the sapiens cells, then the thing won't work properly. Holobionts don't form lineages, but only lineages evolve. So you've either got to deny that humans evolve, or you've got to deny that humans are functional organisms. And both of those consequences are unsatisfactory on the thing view. So I wonder whether or not there's a way for broadly a thing theorist to respond here. Or another way of putting this actually is whether or not part of this verdict depends on reifying processes too much. One particular process, namely reproduction. And here I have in mind some work by Mathieu Charbonneau and also some more recent work by Sophie Feigl and others. And my spies tell me that Tyler might be working on something along these lines as well. So here's the made-up evolutionary scenario. So imagine you've got two kinds of organisms in your population. You've got these orange ones with the red outlines, and they can move really, really fast. Hence the racing colour. And then you've got these kind of triangle blue ones with green outlines, and they don't go so fast. And it turns out that speed is really helpful because you avoid predators that way. So you skip to the next generation and you find, as you'd expect in a selective situation, if they can avoid predators better, you now got loads more of these ones, and you've still got the same number of these. So you've got increasing frequency over time. And it might be that this happens just because of simple reproduction. No problem at all. Just have babies in the normal way, whatever that is. But it needn't work that way, right? I mean, it might work in a very, very different way. So it might be that what happens here is that you have something like a straightforward reproductive relationship going on with the big orange blobby bit of these organisms. But maybe the crucial red circle is passed on to the next generation in a very, very different way, maybe into some kind of central reservoir and then back out again as they're attracted by the orange bits, right? You could imagine this maybe being depositing a gut symbiont out into the environment and then ingesting it again later, if you like. You can imagine this to be whatever kind of peculiar roundabout route that you want. And the important thing, it seems to me, is that here, even though this is going to turn out to be a holobiont, and in that sense, it's not lineage forming, in the sense that, who knows whether the bacteria from this one are going to end up in these ones or whether they're going to end up over here, right? This can travel in all sorts of different directions, so the lineages are not going to be coinciding. In spite of that, it still looks like a perfectly straightforward case of selection at work. And so then when you go back to what John says, if they're not lineage forming, it appears they're not the individuals that evolve. I guess I'm not quite sure how to read that statement, because you might still think that there's a perfectly straightforward sense in which you have an evolutionary process going on here, where these orange ones are out reproducing these blue ones, even though these are not, by hypothesis, lineage forming. And so then you might also think that these are the individuals that evolved, simply because you can tell that kind of natural selection story. Okay. Final section. I really do think that John makes an exceptionally persuasive case for the process view, having all sorts of tails. And here I just want to try to go with that flow and pick up a couple more things. And actually, to be fair to John, these I think are both themes that John alludes to pretty strongly in the book anyway, although maybe not spending quite so much time on. But these are things where I also find that the process view very helpful. Now, I think this is a point where John is particularly focused, if I recall correctly, on personal identity. John does point out, and I think this is really important, John does point out that there's a kind of arbitrariness associated to when one is going to claim that a new human life has started. So we've already talked about that in the context of pregnancy as bifurcation with no clear specific moment of separation. But I think it's also true when you think about earlier moments of origination. So John says the egg precedes fertilization. And we could perfectly well trace the human life back to the formation of that egg cell. You don't have to think of the sperm and the egg coming together as the origination of an individual life. A tiny sperm embedding itself in the relatively enormous egg no more necessitates us thinking of the latter ceasing to exist, and as a tributary running into the Mississippi, or for that matter, a tree falling into it, forces to say that the rivers cease to exist. We want to address the ethical, social, and political questions about what rights we reasonably attribute to a developed and unborn human and to a mature female human when these conflict. We shouldn't look to biology for an answer. So most of this is about ethical issues around abortion. I think it's also really important, and you talk about parfit a little bit in this work. I think it's really helpful to stress not humans as having easily identifiable origins, but as origination itself as a process that takes place over time. It seems to me that focusing on origination rather than focusing on origins actually has quite significant impact on how bioethicists reason. Bioethicists have a strong tendency to draw, in some ways, surprisingly strong practical policy conclusions from claims about origin essentialism, and usually from a particularly contentious version of origin essentialism that says that a given individual could not possibly have originated from different gametes coming together. And that leads to all kinds of really quite strong conclusions in that community about whether or not some reproductive technologies, for example, are genuinely therapeutic, or whether they simply affect which people end up coming to exist. And it seems to me that if one takes this less essentialist, rather more pragmatic approach to origination as an extended process, it has really quite significant payoffs in these areas. So that's one. And here's the other one, and then I'll stop. John very explicitly talks about human development as an open-ended process. And he uses this in part, and this is an old theme from John's work, it goes back a long way. He uses this in part to cast doubt on evolutionary psychology. The atavism of evolutionary psychology, the idea that the roots of human behavior were shaped in a distant past age, depends on the idea that evolution is wholly genetic. And the accumulation of the genes supposedly sufficient to shape behavior would take thousands of generations. But more expansive views of evolution include other forms of inheritance, such as cultural or epigenetic, and taking account also of the changes to the environment produced by the evolving population, niche construction, these can promote far more rapid changes. Now, I agree with this. What's important to note, though, is that simply moving to an approach that endorses cultural inheritance doesn't necessarily get rid of some of the objectionable features of the earlier evolutionary psychological. So even theorists who put a lot of stress on the importance of cultural inheritance, even theorists who put a lot of stress in our species on the payoffs that we can pick up from learning from each other, even those theorists follow quite a few moves of earlier evolutionary psychologists. So, for example, the way that those theorists will often explain things is they will say, yes, learning is extraordinarily important in our species. And that's because the Pleistocene, that's because the Stone Age was a period characterized by extreme environmental uncertainty. And so it was very, very important for our ancestors to acquire genetic adaptations that led them to learn in a specific way from other people, because those learning dispositions would have the greatest fitness payoff. So you still have, in a sense, modern people with Stone Age minds. The Stone Age minds are characterized by a set of genetically controlled adaptations to learn from others. And so what you have here is you have another iteration of a certain kind of evolutionary approach. It's not a kind of a fully blank slate view, and it's not really clear that anybody ever really endorsed a fully blank slate view. It's not a fully blank slate view, but it is a view that says that there are stable learning biases dictating what will be written into the mind later. Now, it seems to me that John's focus on evolution is what I'm putting here as a concatenation of developmental processes, nothing more to evolution than a series of local developmental episodes, is very effective in drawing attention to the need to reconstruct the organism in each generational round. And if that's what happens, then, for example, changes in developmental resources bring with it considerable possibilities for change in the various stages of the reconstructed organism. So John says explicitly, we should see humans as open-ended developmental processes. And all evolutionists, even the evolutionists that place great stress on these so-called learning biases, it seems to me have a lot to gain by asking precisely how those alleged learning biases develop. That's because there's still too much tendency, even in that camp, to think of those biases as unproblematically genetically specified. And those theorists usually spend far too little time looking at the precise question of exactly how they think those biases arise. Okay. I think that's enough. I want to thank John. Thank Adam as well for helping to organise this, Chi for helping to organise it too, and Josh. And also Cassandra again for helping me out with you. Thank you very much.
I'm tempted to ask you to move that slide, John, since I'm much bigger than I would like.
So am I in a different way. But, so thanks, Tim. That was really, really nice. And I guess the only thing is always makes me, why didn't I force you to read the book before I published it? So basically, just very quickly, the thing about, I think you exactly summarized my views correctly about things. It's a constant challenge to write about there not being any things, because anything you say, everything you say something, and language is just so focused around the thing. But that's not an excuse for some of. I think there's some sloppiness there. I think but what you and I guess there is one other thing, which is I don't, for reasons of expertise, really want to engage too much with the physics and the chemistry, because obviously they're experts on these things. Generally, when I talk to them, they're much more committed to process than people interested in biology, particularly the physicists who don't seem to have things at all anymore. But having said, so what I actually think, and I think this is just what you characterized, I think the machine, the toaster, is very stable because the bonding of the atoms and so on is in materials that are very, very stable eddies. But of course, actually there, I think if you talk to the physicists, and you probably knows something, but you've got just like all kinds of I mean, you haven't got little balls with little rods connecting them. You've got little whirls and squiggles and stuff kind of squiggling into one another. So I think at the appropriate level, you've always got process, but I don't think I can improve on the charitable summary of my views. I do think I certainly believe its processes all the way down, and just some entities are very stable. And there are distinctive ways in which biological processes are much more interestingly stabilized than basically all the squeaky stuff that goes on at the fundamental physical level. Things and essences. I mean, I guess a couple of things to say about that. One, of course, is I guess it's just biographical. I've been arguing about essences for longer than I can even admit. And so this long precedes my awareness that I was talking about processes. So partly that's just, that may explain some of the sloppiness in my dismissal of essences. I've been dismissing them since I dismissed anything. But I think you're right. I think you can do thingy sort of views without essences and add essence-y sort of things to processes. But I would say there are a lot of questions that thingy people like to ask that you are liberated from once you accept a processy view. For example, how many things are there? That's pretty fundamental to the condition of thing or substance thinking. I mean, that's, sortals are count terms, and they sort things, say what kind of a thing is, so you can count them. So this question of boundaries, and we're bang on about rivers and things, is it a river, is it a tributary, how many tributaries are there, all these sorts of questions that paradigmatic processes you get immediately to the question, why are you asking? And until you answer that, you don't know how to answer. So, and I guess also, and you discussed this, what is it for them to continue? And I do talk mostly about personal identity, but it's a very general question that I think people have traditionally wanted to answer. When did it begin? When did it end? What constitutes its continuing to exist? And the standard answer is you have to find the essential property. When that comes into being, it comes into being. When that ceases to apply to it, it ceases to exist. Now, of course, you could find other answers to that. So if it seems as if I'm saying, these two are kind of analytically connected, I think that's probably wrong, but that they are very closely connected in terms of raising questions that people spend a lot of time on, and they'd be better advised spending their time on quite different questions. So that's a very trivial point, just because, and here I rely on hearsay, but my erstwhile colleague Dan Nicholson, co-edited that book with, I think, thinks of Needham as one of the early process biologists. Now, I don't have anything to say particular about the quote, except a very kind of unfair comment. But you did stop reading at the point where he went on to say something about in the midst of dialectical process, and I think that so I'm not sure whether Needham is somebody I can worry about, particularly because, as you did read out, the transitions between these stages are dialectical processes, and I mean, we could have a long discussion about what that means, but I don't think it's what, for example, traditional reductionists thought of as the relation between physics and chemistry, or chemistry and molecular biology. But that's just so. Finally, just a quick point about those lineages. I think I may say, but maybe I didn't, that can define holobiont lineages. Right, I'm not sure if I think I may have said that in the book. I think that, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, I guess because I don't have a fairly loose view of lineages, but you still have questions that are hard to reconcile. I mean, what is the functional organism? What is the and I guess one of the things I would draw a more complicated picture. So your red box, only a few things coming out of the red box are actually going into the circles. Most of them are going off somewhere else. It's not the concept of reproduction that you primarily want for evolutionary theory. So a minimal point, which may be less than what I seem to be claiming, is different goals, i.e. understanding evolution by natural selection versus understanding human functioning, require different conceptions. And again, it's very hard to get those different conceptions in a thing world, much easier when you see all these entangled fluxes of things that can be conceptual. So the big point, and I think you made this clear, and I don't look, there's be a response on it, but that this world of entangled flux is a world in which any conceptual work of distinguishing things, kinds of things, whether they entities, kinds of entities, lineages over time between these things, is not just given by nature. And so most, all the thing talk, the essence talk, all of these is trying to get away from the idea that we're just doing an ontology that ultimately is given to us by nature, and that is always relative to some particular context, function, and so on. But mostly, thank you for your really
No, thank you.
generous, helpful comments.